Sup? So, after reminiscing about Death Note, which I did in my previous video, I was in a very Death Note-y mood, and it inspired me to do something that I hadn't done since it first came out, and that was watch the live-action Death Note movie that was released on Netflix in 2017. If you're not familiar with this movie, back in 2017, Western live-action adaptations of anime shows were still incredibly rare. And because they were so rare, and because Death Note was so popular, when this movie came out, it got a lot of attention. And as you might have guessed, anime fans overwhelmingly hated this movie because it made pretty big changes to the source material that anime fans did not appreciate. It was still about a teenager casting judgment on criminals using the Death Note, but instead of it being centered on a Japanese teenager named Light Yagami, it was centered on a white teenager named Light Turner, who now lived in Seattle. And instead of him being lusted after by a blonde idol named Misa, he was lusted after by a nihilistic cheerleader named Mia, and so on. And for this and other reasons, the Netflix Death Note movie became infamous. It became this prime example that people would point to as proof that Hollywood shouldn't even bother to try to turn anime shows into live-action movies, because this is how it can turn out. But I decided to rewatch this movie anyway, because it had been so long since I'd seen it that I was curious about how I'd feel about it all these years later. And I'll tell you what, I didn't hate it. I don't think this movie is great, to be clear. I'm not trying to tell you it's some hidden classic or something. It's got general movie problems, like pacing issues and stuff. But I also don't think it's the atrocity that it was seen as when it first came out. At the same time, I could also understand, when I was watching this, why this didn't work as a proper Death Note movie for an enormous amount of people. And so, instead of reviewing this movie, I thought it'd be a good exercise to explore why this didn't work as a good Death Note movie to so many people, and, more specifically, how this could have worked. Because I came away from this movie sincerely believing that with a few alterations, this easily could have been considered a fun throwaway movie that fans of the anime could have liked, as opposed to how fans actually saw it, which was as a total abomination. So, the first thing that you have to talk about with this movie is that the characters in this movie are very different from how they are in the anime. It's not just that they look different. It's not just that Light Turner doesn't physically resemble Light Yagami much at all, to put it mildly. It's that they're basically different people. Light Turner is not the cold, calculating, mustache-twirling mastermind that Light Yagami is. Mia is not the airhead that Misa is. L, who's also in the movie, shares a few of the attributes that the L in the anime does, but otherwise is not remotely as composed as the L in the anime. Light's dad is still a police officer in the movie, but he feels like a totally different character from how he was in the anime. And Ryuk is in the movie, but now he's like a Pennywise puppet master character who's forcing Light to do all this, instead of how it was in the anime when he was just an observer. And the fatal mistake that this movie made was having these characters still be named after the anime characters, in spite of how different they were from them. Because when you adapt characters from a beloved franchise and you make them not like those characters, you're basically asking the fans of the original source material to be pissed at you. It's like, if you make a movie that's loosely based on Romeo and Juliet, but you don't call the characters Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare fans could accept it for what it is, and they might even enjoy spotting the parallels between these new characters and the ones that inspired them. But if you made a movie about Romeo and Juliet and you changed everything about the characters and you still called them Romeo and Juliet, people would be pissed because they'd see it as a desecration of this work that they admire. If the main character of the 2017 Death Note movie was named Brent, and if his girlfriend was named Ashley, and if L was named Derek, and if the movie was called Death Note New Era or something, instead of just Death Note, I don't believe that Death Note fans would have had their knives out for this. But instead, by having the characters be iterations of the old characters by name, the movie was directing the audience to compare these characters to the anime characters. And when you've gone so far as to change the appearance and personality and backstory and temperament and ethics of the main character, which they do, you are setting yourself up for a backlash, because those are not small incidental changes. Light Turner is not at all like Light Yagami, and the same thing is true of L. In the anime, L is not an overly emotional character at all. He's not someone who flies off the handle. And yet in the movie, he's so emotional that there are moments in it where he's like out of control. If someone didn't know that this was a Death Note movie, but they were familiar with the anime, and you asked them to guess who the character in this scene was, you could give them 1,000 chances and they would not come up with L. Like, that's how dissimilar these characters are from their anime counterparts, outside of having very cosmetic attributes, like the fact that L sits the same way that he does in the show. And so, when fans of the show watch this movie, it only makes sense that they would find the differences between the anime characters and the movie characters to be rather aggravating, because the movie characters were not faithfully representing what the anime characters were like. But that's why the easy solution was just change their names. If this movie had named these characters Brent and Ashley and Derek, or whatever you want, it would have put enough separation between itself and the anime that fans would have been more charitable to this, because they would have been more inclined to accept it as its own unique thing, as opposed to how they actually saw it, which was an adaptation that was getting it all wrong. In fact, this leads me to the next change that I would have made for this movie. I wouldn't have made its story a parallel to the Death Note anime. In the movie, the story eventually splits off and becomes its own thing, but the beginning of it is just like the anime. A Death Note falls from the sky at school, and Light picks it up. He starts punishing criminals, Mia falls for him, the legend of Kira is born, the FBI investigates Kira, L investigates Kira, etc., etc. And the problem with doing this is that it just reinforced the idea to people that this movie was supposed to be like the show. And as such, it lent more fuel for anime fans to have wanted the movie characters to be just like the anime characters. And so, this story being like the anime story for such a big part of it was a detriment more than anything, because it just heightened the contrasts that were already there. It's why this movie wound up being so disliked, even though the story was like the animes for so much of it. Doing that bought this movie nothing. And so, what I also think they should have done, if they were going to have these characters be so different from the anime characters, is they should have removed everything about this story that was like the anime story from this movie's DNA. So, no Kira, no FBI, no police officer dad, no genius investigator, no Ryuk, nothing. Just go all the way with telling an entirely different story about an entirely different teenager who discovers a Death Note one day. Have the Death Note be the only constant. If that's what they'd done, even if anime fans didn't like this movie, they wouldn't have felt like it besmirched the show like they did with the final product, because they would have been able to see it as this entirely different thing. They wouldn't have spent the whole movie looking at this character and thinking, you're not Light to me. Why isn't he more like Light? Because he wouldn't have literally been Light, quote unquote, and wouldn't have been following in Light Yagami's footsteps the way he does in this movie. Beyond that, this story would have been so much more compelling if it was a brand new narrative and wasn't spending so much time rehashing the anime anyway. There's a moment in the anime when Ryuk mentions that other Death Notes have come to the human world before, and that whenever a human has found a Death Note, it's almost always gone horribly for them. And I thought that was interesting because to me, that's an avenue that you could totally explore in this franchise. In the same way that the Predator franchise eventually realized that one way to make good Predator movies was to show different people throughout history coming face to face with the Predator, I think a great way to expand the universe of Death Note would be to show different people throughout history coming in contact with a Death Note and seeing what a different person in a different circumstance would do with the ability to kill almost anyone they wanted. If this movie was about a totally different teenager in a totally different setting finding a Death Note, I think Death Note fans would have found it fascinating because you know what a megalomaniac like Light Yagami would do with a Death Note, but what would a different, non-idealistic high school student do with it? That, to me, is an irresistible angle, and to not take advantage of it felt like a missed opportunity to me here. Also, an added bonus with cleaning the slate like this is that it would have made the movie flow better, because it wouldn't have spent so much time trying to condense parts of the anime show into a single movie, which is a very difficult thing to do. And it would have created more of an impetus to streamline the lore of the Death Note so that it was more easy to understand. In the movie, they show that there are like 100 different rules to the Death Note, and that's way too many. They should have just kept it simple like they did in the anime. And finally, the last thing that I would have done with this movie is that I would have put L in high school with Light. In the anime, the best parts of the show were the back and forth conversations between Light and L, in which they were both trying to figure each other out. And in the anime, L always suspected that Light could be Kira, but he knew he needed to find proof of it before he could actually be sure of it. In the Netflix movie, however, L determines that Light is Kira almost immediately, and he does it without having a single interaction with Light first. Like, the first time they meet, he's like, I know you're Kira. And if you're a huge fan of the anime, seeing L come to this conclusion so quickly without even talking to Light first is incredibly unsatisfying. It feels really, really rushed. And to me, it speaks to the complications of keeping L as a private investigator in a movie adaptation. Because when you do that, there's this built-in separation of space between him and Light that keeps them from actually physically interacting with each other that much. And while you can naturally bridge that divide in a TV show, in a movie, you don't have that much time to play with. And so Light and L barely spend any time together in this movie, when the scenes with them together should have been the highlights of this movie. And so what I believe would have made this movie work better, since they already made all these other changes to the characters, is if you took this character and you made him a student. And instead of him being a detective named L, he's just a weird, super smart kid named Derek or something, who sits in the back of class and doesn't talk to many people, and that is how he naturally gets to be around the main character all the time. And what if this movie was about a teenager who discovers the Death Note, and the teenager is an edgelord with dumb, contradictory beliefs, like a lot of teenagers have, and he starts killing people for fun. He starts dicking around with the Death Note, like a lot of people would do, and one day, he goes too far with it and kills another student, or a teacher, or someone close to him, and he immediately regrets it, and no one suspects that he had anything to do with it, except for the weird kid who sits behind him in class, our L substitute, who, because of how perceptive he is, realizes that the main character is almost certainly the killer, even if he doesn't know how he did it. And the rest of the movie would be about our L substitute initiating all of these conversations with our Light substitute and trying to figure out how he could have done it, while our Light substitute tries to figure out how much he knows and if it'd be wise to try to take care of him. That, to me, would have been a much better movie than the movie we got. And the reason I'm eager to suggest these changes is because even though the characters in the Netflix movie were not like the characters in the anime, I honestly thought the actors in it did a good job. It wasn't their fault that they were portraying people who were way off from the anime characters. I came away from this movie believing that it did have a lot of potential, and that if the movie hadn't tried the half-measure approach of being like the anime in some ways and different from it in others, and had just gone all the way with telling a brand new story with brand new characters with these actors, this movie could have been awesome. But alas, that's not what happened. And viewers were understandably not thrilled with the outcome that they got. But I will reiterate, I also don't think this movie is horrible. I don't think it's very good. Again, I'm not trying to sell this as, some gem that the critics didn't understand or something. But I think that if you're able to compartmentalize this movie from the anime show, I think the 2017 movie kind of works as like a tame Final Destination movie. This is the movie equivalent of a frozen microwave dinner that you can pick up at a convenience store. Is it a good meal? Not really, but hey, you can get some disposable enjoyment out of this. There are way worse movies out there than this. At the same time, the movie does itself no favors by being a Death Note movie that's less appealing the closer you are to the thing that this is based off of. It's a Death Note movie that works better if you don't like Death Note. And that's why this movie would have been infinitely better off by just being something that could have been interesting to everybody. And the only way to do that would have been to tell a story that was entirely new, in my opinion.